Good afternoon, everyone. If you're just logging on, we'll give it a few minutes, give everyone a chance to log on. If you feel like putting a message in the chat, if you know Chet or Steve, you want to send a message, please do. Also, always lovely to know where people are zooming in from. So feel free to put a message in the chat. Good afternoon, everyone. If you're just logging on, it's about 12:01. We'll give it another minute or two, give everyone a chance to log on. Always glad to see where you're zooming in from. You're welcome to put a message in the chat, and look forward to taking off with this program shortly. Thank you. Also, do think of your questions. We're going to have you put your questions in the Q&A, not in the chat. So thank you. Hi, welcome everyone. I'm just going to say an announcement one last time, just waiting to make sure everyone has a chance to log on. You're welcome to give us a message in the chat. We're particularly interested in knowing where people are logging on from. Thank you. And we're going to get started very, very shortly. I think we will get started. I want to wish everyone a good afternoon. My name is Judy Margles. I'm the director of the Oregon Jewish Museum and the Center for Holocaust Education. I do want to welcome you all to today's program with journalist Steve Forrester, historian Chet Orlof, where we're going to be discussing Steve's newest publication about one of Oregon's trailblazing politicians, Richard Neuberger. The museum's mission is to explore the legacy of the Jewish experience in Oregon, teach the universal lessons of the Holocaust, and provide opportunities for intercultural conversation. We challenge our visitors to resist indifference and discrimination and to envision a just and inclusive world. We offer all of our virtual programming, including today's event and recording of past events, without charge. We're always grateful for any donation that you might be able to make to support our work. You'll find information about upcoming programming, membership opportunities, or donating on our website. In addition to our 3 core exhibitions about the Holocaust, discrimination and resistance in Oregon, and the Oregon Jewish experience, our exhibition about Lawrence Halprin and his Portland fountains continues through late November. On Sunday, December 12th, we're opening our long-awaited exhibition To Bear Witness, Extraordinary Lives, which features the stories of 14 refugees and survivors of genocide that found safe haven in Oregon. So today's format is going to be conversational. We really want to hear from all of you. I think everybody knows by now the Q&A tab is where we're going to ask you to put your questions rather than in the chat, just makes it easier to track them. And we will endeavor to answer as many questions as we possibly can. So the more I've learned about Richard Neuberger, and I've really learned most of what I know since first meeting Steve a few years back when he was embarking on research for his book, there's a word that has really struck me how I would describe him, and that's the word unambiguous. From his time as a writer for his high school newspaper, and I think he was writing on sports at that time, to a trip with his uncle to Germany in 1933, articles he wrote for the New York Times and other prestigious newspapers and journals, and ultimately his election as the 2nd Jewish United States Senator. He pursued a progressive agenda that included environmental and civil rights issues, so much more, with a clear-eyed vision. And I'm so delighted to be here with Steve and Chet today, and we're going to learn a lot more about Richard Neuberger. Steve Forrester has had an illustrious career as a journalist and publisher, including as editor and publisher of the Daily Historian for the 28 years. He's currently the president of the EO Media Group. He was the founding president of Liberty Restoration, a private nonprofit that restored the historic Liberty Theater in Astoria, where he lives today. He's also served as the chairman of the Oregon Arts Commission. He served in Vietnam with the US Marine Corps in 1973. He was also one of the principals who started Willamette Week. Chet Orlof has served as a Peace Corps teacher, taught urban design, planning, history, and museum studies at Portland State University and the University of Oregon. He's worked as the director of the Pamplin International Collection, the Virtual Museum of the City, the Oregon Historical Society, and other organizations. He's also served or is serving on Portland's planning, cultural, parks, and landmark commissions, as well as numerous local, state, and national arts, historical, and museum committees and institutions. So I really want to welcome you both today. Thank you so much for being here. And Steve, I do want to start with you and give you a chance to expand a little bit about Neuberger. You're fascinated with him, but tell us what drew you to write about him, and give us some introductory material to chew on. Thank you.
Thank you, Judy. My father and Dick Neuberger met in the 1930s. I did not realize this until recently. I found an interview my father gave to an Oregon State University publication. My dad was the sports editor of the Oregon State College Barometer. Dick Neuberger was the sports editor of the University of Oregon Emerald. So they got to know each other. And then I presume they also met within the confines of the Oregonians newsroom. They had the same mentor there, a man named L.H. Gregory, who was the sports editor. Both of them, like so many young journalists, loved writing about sports and so forth. So the Neubergers would come to our home in Pendleton. And the last visit, I found it in the family guest book, was in 1959. And by the time I was 13 by then and was paying more attention or more aware of what I was looking at, I remember vividly sitting across the table from Senator Neuberger at lunch. He was then senator. And they had been to a football game the day prior at Multnomah Stadium. The Air Force Academy had played, and they brought with them a falcon, which they displayed at halftime. Dick was fascinated with the falcon. He went home and he read everything he could read about falcons. This is before the internet, so I was presuming it was an encyclopedia he pulled out. And he proceeded to tell us all about this falcon. I had never seen a man so with such a voracious intellect. And so that I think it was, as you can tell, an indelible impression he made on me. Before I left Willamette Week, or right after I left Willamette Week, we sold Willamette Week in about 77, something like that. I started to interview all of the Neuberger family and his contemporaries. Went to Maureen, his widow, said I'd like to do his biography. And fortunately, this all happened. They are all gone, of course. And so I have this sort of audio library of all these voices from that period of time. So that's the essence of my fascination with Dick Neuberger. When I spoke to the 2018 annual meeting of the museum, it sort of forced me to get my act together and my chapter opened. And so that's how I did that. So I want to give another, I've written a fragment that may be useful in the biography that I'm going to come out with in a couple of years. And this will be about 2 minutes, I would say. At the age of 29, Emanuel Rose became rabbi of Temple Beth Israel. 7 weeks following Rose's first service, Oregon's most prominent Jewish public figure died. On Sunday, March 13, 1960, Rabbi Rose officiated at the memorial service of Senator Richard Neuberger, who had died on March 8th. Obituaries in national and Oregon newspapers noted that Neuberger was an especially prolific writer, that he was the first Democrat whom Oregon had elected to the US Senate in 40 years, and that he was the second Jew elected to the US Senate following enactment of the 17th Amendment. That day in Northwest Portland was highly emotional because Neuberger's death at the age of 49 had cut off an exceptionally productive freshman term in the United States Senate. Outside on the Temple grounds, some 300 postal workers in uniform stood in silent tribute to the senator in gratitude for their pay raises in which he had played a prominent role. In Alaska, a mountain would be named after the deceased senator. The Magazine Writers of America would create an annual award in his name, and so did the Oregon Environmental Council. Inside sat a delegation of 12 senators led by Senator Majority Leader Lyndon Johnson. There were also 4 members of the House of Representatives. Following a reading of the 23rd Psalm, Rabbi Rose said, quote, "Our rabbis many centuries ago sought to select the most meaningful quality character of man. One of the phrases they selected was a good name. Senator Richard Neuberger had a good name," close quote. But that good name came at a price. When Neuberger disturbed the peace as a student editor at the University of Oregon by raising issues of social welfare for needy students during the Depression, the fraternity establishment placed tin cans around the campus with signs inviting contributions, quote, to send Dickie, quote, to an Eastern school. They also introduced a resolution that stated, "Be it resolved, we, the individual students in the University of Oregon, wish to contribute to a scholarship fund to aid Richard L. Neuberger to enroll in some distant Eastern college or university at his earliest convenience," close quote. Neuberger responded graciously, saying that these contributions should be given to students who needed the financial support. But the virulent undertone of this campus behavior was not lost on Maurice Sellon, who wrote in the Jewish Scribe that Neuberger had been, quote, vilified, attacked, castigated, and anathematized by bell, book, and candle. If I may be permitted to coin a word, wrote Sellon, he was also anti-Semitized, close quote. The ultimate setback came when law school dean Wayne Morris flunked Neuberger in his criminal law class. Morris subsequently called Neuberger's parents to suggest they were wasting their money on law school. Neuberger's roommate, Steve Kahn, whom I interviewed, told me that Neuberger was, quote, despondent, quote. Neuberger left the university and never earned a degree. Flunking out of college is dispiriting. Neuberger responded with creativity by selling his first article to the New York Times. He followed that with 9 more Times articles in the following year, as well as 2 to The Nation magazine. His phenomenal career as a magazine and newspaper journalist was well off the ground. That kind of resilience describes much of Dick Neuberger's life. End of fragment. At the heart of Dick's life was a family dynamic and a family business, which was the Bohemian Restaurant. Can we have that slide, please? The Bohemian was on Washington Street, I believe, right off 9th. And it was, there were some German specialties, especially in the bakery side of things, but it was renowned as a, I don't know if you ever ate there, Chet, but my mother took me there once. It was renowned as a place where you could get really good food for a modest price. And it was a winning formula. In time, there would be, I think, 3 or 4 restaurants in the Neuberger ownership.
They made great milkshakes, by the way, Steve.
Ah, I wish I could go back. Next slide, please. This is Dick and his father, Isaac, better known as Ike. And Dick and his father were estranged. I sort of, early in my research, I got hints of this. And then one night, interviewing Elizabeth Ducey over dinner, I said, what was the relationship? And she simply bluntly said, which is what Elizabeth Ducey usually did. She said they were estranged. Ike had a gambling problem. He was a compulsive gambler, and he almost took the family business into insolvency. Next slide, please. Here is Dick with his mother, Ruth. He's on leave from Alaska, World War II. And Ruth was a remarkable figure. Her niece, Ann Goodsell, has told me that after Ike was removed from running the restaurant at an emergency meeting of the family business, just prior to Dick's going to Alaska, that Ruth was thrust into a role of business leadership, which he had never done. Their partner, the family's partner in the restaurant, was George O'Neill, a very talented food side man. And Anne said to me that the pressures of this new responsibility on Ruth caused her every morning before going to work to vomit. And so that gives you a feeling for just how big that transformation was. I met Ruth in her apartment at, I think it was Park Place. And I've often told this story that I was greeted with a cup of coffee and a wonderful pastry, all of the restaurant, I'm sure, and the most starched napkin I've ever probably put in my lap. And she was every inch the matriarch and gave me quite an interview. The other element in Dick's family story was his sister Jane. Jane, there's Dick at the typewriter. Yeah, hold that for a second. But like Dick, Jane had the writer gene. I'm not as well acquainted with her articles and books, but there is an archive of Jane's papers at Reed College. And Jane was a very generous interview with me. So this is Dick in the study. I've forgotten which home it is. Ann Goodsell has told me that, whether it was the one on Westover Road or at Alpine Terrace. But Time Magazine referred to his enormous output of nonfiction as, they called it a Niagara of nonfiction, which was great Time speak, Time Magazine speak. It's estimated that in his lifetime, he wrote some 750 articles. And the number of newspaper articles is not chronicled. He wrote for quite an array of magazines, starting at the top with the New York Times Magazine, the Atlantic, Harper's, and then working his way down. He wrote for magazines like Field and Stream, or the Elks Magazine, or the Eagles Magazine. My father said that Dick called this process shingling, that he would take a topic and create one shingle, and then another, he would rewrite it or redo it for another publication. Jane's daughters, Jane Goodsell's daughters, Anne and Kate, were nieces of the Neubergers, but they were treated like daughters. They lived with them in Washington, D.C. They've both been invaluable sources of information for me, and generously have lent me the wartime correspondence between Dick Neuberger and Maureen Brown before they were married and she became Maureen Neuberger. Let's see the next slide. So this is Dick and Maureen. This is what I call the Dick and Maureen legislative franchise. I'm often asked about, well, what about Maureen? Because she's in the chapter I've written and she'll be in the full biography. But I don't give full treatment to her. But the point I make is that you cannot tell Dick's story without her, and you can't tell her story without him. Now that might be true in most marriages, but theirs was an exceptional marriage. It had a deep affection side to it, but also a political marketing side, if you will. And this is a terrific marketing piece we're looking at here. It was taken by a photographer who worked for the Oregon Statesman in Salem, and it was taken for Life magazine. Life magazine was doing feature ads all around the country, and this was one of the photos they used. It's on the front on the cover of Dick's book, Adventures in Politics. What else do we have in the way of slides? There we are. This is Election Day in 1954, and Anne Goodsell is to the our left, on Maureen's side. She's very troubled. She's crying. She's been crying. The story behind this is that the Neubergers lived not far from Ainsworth School in Portland Heights. And they walked over to the playground and up to where Anne joined them to walk them into the polling place at the school. And this is a measure of how heated that race was. I remember from Pendleton hearing about it, but this was in Portland in the sort of the epicenter of things for the Neubergers. And the other children on the playground booed Dick Neuberger. And so Anne was very upset over this. And this picture was snapped by, I think, an Oregon Journal photographer. Now let's look at the next slide, the last slide we have. This is 2 or 3 days later. It took so long to count this vote. Dick won by 2,462 votes statewide. That's less than 1 vote per precinct across Oregon. So it did take a couple of days to count the ballots. So here we have Anne and Kate, their little heads there in front of the Neubergers. They're outside the Roosevelt Hotel. I believe that's where the victory party was. Interestingly, I'm sure this has occurred to Chet Orlof more than once. The Roosevelt was adjacent to the Arlington Club, which in those days was the headquarters of the Oregon Republican Party. So at this point, Judy, Chet, I can move on to the Germany trip, but does anything occur to you that so far that you'd like me to illuminate?
Oh, I have so many questions, but and I suspect that Chet does too, but perhaps, Steve, let me just digress a little bit. And Chet, what was your interest? How did you get involved with Steve and this research, and talk a little bit about your participation here?
Yeah, I just parenthetically, or just to begin, I will say that I went to Ainsworth as well as Lincoln High School, and I was sports editor at the same newspaper that Neuberger was sports editor at when he got his start at Lincoln High School. But that's, from there our respective careers went their different directions. But I became interested in Neuberger actually many years ago, actually through Wayne Morse, when I was director of the Historical Society, and we published a biography of Morse by Mason Druckmann, I believe. Steve would know that. And I was also quite close with Marie Neuberger toward the end of her life through my parents, who were great friends with her. Mm. And so I knew her, and therefore him through her, although I'd never had a chance to become acquainted with Neuberger because I was much too young and we hadn't moved to Portland yet. But I became interested in this project when Steve came to me right at the beginning of thinking about this book, Eminent Oregonians. And one of the first things he asked was whether or not I would be interested in writing something for it. And I said, no, I wouldn't, because I was too busy with other projects. But I said I would consider writing a foreword or an introduction, which he ultimately twisted my arm, and I did. But I was constantly involved with Steve. Every few months we would have lunch, or I would meet with his fellow writers, and we would talk about this. So he sort of brought me into the inner circle of all of this. And Steve, you can correct me if my memory is failing on any of this. And then once the whole concept had been brought to fruition and the book was moving through its various paces, he then generously allowed me to read some of the early drafts, so I was able to keep up with things. But I was always encouraging Steve to consider people whom I considered other eminent Oregonians, because I thought certainly Duniway and Chief Joseph, who was another one who was considered, certainly Neuberger, Applegate, but there were others such as Thomas Lamb Eliot and Oswald West, and certainly many others whose names I thought also deserved eminence, if we consider eminence as a quality of characteristic of certain Oregonians, which I do. But I think this is a great beginning, and I think Steve and his co-authors have given Oregonians historically something to really chew on and think about, especially in a very difficult time in our nation's history.
Well, thank you. I do want to hold up the book because my next question is, I have two questions sort of about the book for Steve and Chet. You're welcome to hop in there. So this, Steve mentioned he's writing a fuller biography of Richard Neuberger, but this is the book that's out now, and there is a chapter in the book about Richard Neuberger. And we do have copies for sale in our gift shop. I just have to put that plug in there. But Steve, you know, the book is called Eminent Oregonians. It is a fascinating title that you have there. It is named, I saw that you totally took it from Linton Strackey's Eminent Victorians, which was published more than 100 years ago. That book too dealt with figures in British history who were sort of slightly off in the margins a little bit. So I'd love to know if it was you who came up with that title, or how that title came to be, and what connected you with wanting that title. And then let's just talk briefly about the other two figures in the book, Abigail Scott Duniway and Jesse Applegate. How do you connect the three together? So why do you see those three as the eminent Oregonians?
Yeah, well, I can't remember exactly when I found Eminent Victorians, but I was quite struck by it. And as much as anything, I was struck by how Strachey,
Strachey, sorry.
If that's the correct pronunciation, I've never been corrected on that. At any rate, how he transformed the writing of biography at that time, in the sense that he did not deliver this huge tome. He delivered, four. I think he had 4 or 5 in his that are they're not bite-sized, but they're all about 15,000 words, which is what we've done here, give or take. And so that's where the title came from. And truth be told, in 2010, when Astoria turned 200, we brought out a book called Eminent Astorians, and so forth. So now, where did the others come from? Well, I wanted Abigail Scott Duniway in the book. There's a lot of academic literature about her, and it's pretty good stuff, but it's not the life, if you will. And so I wanted to find a woman writer to do that. And it took me a while to do that. And I finally asked Greg Noakes, who wrote the Applegate chapter. I said, I don't get it, Greg. I cannot find a writer for this. And he said, what about Jane Kirkpatrick? Jane is a novelist out of Bend, very prolific. I think she's written some, gee whiz, is it 40 or 80 books, novels? And so Jane agreed to do it. And it was a challenge for her because she writes fiction, and she'd not done anything quite like this. I wanted Greg to write something because he's another proven writer. In his retirement from daily journalism, he's brought out Murdered for Gold, and he brought out Slavery in Oregon, and then the biography of Peter Burnett. And so I approached Greg about doing a chapter. He was reluctant, but our lunch ended with him saying yes. He said, well, I'm really kind of fascinated with Jesse Applegate. So that's where that came from. So, I can't tell you that I had any overarching scheme in mind when I approached them. I approached the writers. Duniway for sure. I wanted, because she's an icon in my book, and sort of undiscovered in a certain way. And I will say, in the 6 weeks since the book has come out, I've heard from a number of readers, and it's fascinating what they did not know about these people. People like Chet and I, who talk about this stuff, tend to think people know, and they don't. With Neuberger, it is almost completely, I didn't know anything about this guy. And so that's the origin of the book.
Thank you. So can we, we know, so my introduction to Richard Neuberger was his article that was published in The Nation in 1933. So in 1933, Richard Neuberger went with his uncle to Germany 1933 is the date, of course, that Hitler came to power, and it is the date by which historians say the Holocaust began, right? And we know from that article that what he encountered was horrific. He writes in that article about seeing Jews with their traditional head coverings, men being beaten on the streets. And the article, right, it's so prescient about what was to come. So I'd love, talk a little bit about the article, the reaction. So the article was published in the high school, in the University of Oregon journal, right? The Emerald.
No.
Oh, sorry.
Yeah.
Okay. Oh, then it was published. It was published in the Nation, though. So
Yes.
Yeah. I mean, my reaction to the article at the time and the way that this whole trip shaped his sense as a civil rights advocate. I think that's kind of the gist of my question. But you probably have more to say about that.
Certainly. Well, it's 3 years after Dick has graduated from Lincoln High School. He's 20, whoops, I fell on the floor, let's forget that. He's 23, maybe 21, 23, right in there. And it's a mark. Dick was a prodigy and he was very precocious. He didn't hesitate to do grand things. And so when he was editor of the Emerald, the front pages of that newspaper were quite something. He really had a touch. And one of the most striking front pages he put out in, I think, October of 1930, no, and that's when they went to Germany, but was in the center of the front page was a picture of Hitler giving the Nazi salute. And the headline was, "A Chancellor Salutes His Legions." Well, I don't think many college newspapers in America were putting that on their front page then. So that's sort of the first inkling you've got that he's thinking about something. I've asked Anne and Kate Goodsell, where did the idea come from? Was it Julius's, his cousin, his uncle's idea, or was it Dick's? She said, I think it was Dick's, with his repertorial instinct, that he saw a big story there. So they crossed the Atlantic in October of 1933, or in August, actually. The article's published in October. And they go to Heinstadt, which was where the family came from, to America. Saw relatives there, eventually, of course, tried to talk them out into leaving. But Dick, with Julius's help, because Julius was fluent in German, Dick was not, met common people off the beaten track, and they told him horrific stories. What Judy says is absolutely true about that article. You can find it online. It's called The New Germany. And I've shown it to 2 or 3 people. I showed it to Richard Meeker, one of the principal owner of Willamette Week. He'd never seen it. And he said the same word that Judy did, how prescient, that he saw all of this coming. I leave it to you to find the article and read it. I won't go through chapter and verse, but he comes back to New York City and he tries to sell it to the New York Times, and the Times didn't buy it. Ruth Neuberger told me, I don't think they felt they could substantiate what he was reporting. So he walked down the street figuratively to the Nation magazine, walked in cold, and he was given to Ernest Greening, who was then one of the editors of the Nation magazine, who bought the article commissioned it. Dick then sat down and wrote it, commissioned it for $38. And not a bad fee, I'm sure, in 1933. And its appearance had a great wake behind it. He was instantly a prominent figure on the East Coast, especially. In those days, all the big cities had Jewish newspapers. They picked up versions of this that he would write for them. He was on he was at the Jewish Congress and was a speaker on a panel. He met some very prominent people, such as Justice Brandeis and Justice Frank, soon to be Justice Frankfurter. And one of the not puzzles, but one of the things that strikes me as curious is he's had this enormous experience. One other detail about the trip to Germany, he was playing tennis on his tennis court with I don't know whom, and he was told to get off the court because he was Jewish. And he was about to put up a little fight, and the family said, no, don't do that. So he left the court. So it wasn't simply what he was told about or observed, it was what happened to him over there that I think must have been striking. So he goes back from New York City and the whole whirl of the East Coast back to the University of Oregon to become a junior. And it must have been, I can't imagine, his vision had been raised enormously. And he goes back to being a college student. He's no longer editor of the Emerald, but they did write about his having done all of this. And it was, when I spoke to the Jewish Museum's annual meeting in 2018, I opened with that anecdote because it's often lost, and thank you for bringing it up, Judy. In the days that I've described Neuberger to friends and colleagues, I always talked about the politics of what he did, which is remarkable as well. But then, oh, by the way, at the age of 23, he goes to Nazi Germany and writes the opening journalistic citing of what's going on.
Thank you. And it's, this trajectory where he was such an eloquent writer and a successful writer, and then this shift to wanting to be in politics. And you describe it in the chapter in Eminent Oregonians, of course, his initial failures, and then ultimately his success against the incumbent Republican Senator Guy Cordon in 1954. So he does become a United States Senator. And I was really struck when that was such a close vote. So of course, what I think my question is a question for the Times. How did, and he was so liberal. So how did he actually sway voters in counties such as Polk and Umatilla, which one doesn't necessarily think of as the most liberal parts of Oregon? And apologies to anyone living there who would disagree with that. But the state, like the country, is divided, and here he won in those counties, which I was fascinated to hear.
Yeah, well, the biggest gift I was given in my research was a graduate thesis out of the University of Oregon. Maureen, after we talked about my doing the biography, she said, "Here, you might want this," and it was it's a thick thesis, unpublished, and I believe the title is The Rhetorical Style of Richard L. Neuberger in the Campaign of 1954. Mm-hmm. And the woman who wrote this, it was for a degree in speech, a master's degree in speech. And it essentially, it walks you through the whole campaign and how Neuberger did it. And what is striking in terms of what you're asking, Judy, about that time and Oregon's makeup is he made a big appeal for the farm vote. Well, you wouldn't do that today because the farm population is, the farms are there, but the ownership setup, et cetera, and the cultural aspect of it is entirely different. But he made great inroads in rural Oregon with that in mind. And Maureen did not hurt in that endeavor. My parents told me that they'd observed, they took the Neubergers out to the little town of Weston outside Pendleton for a farm dinner where Dick spoke. And they said, Dick was a city kid and Maureen was a farm girl. And all of the farm women especially gravitated to Maureen. She had that touch. And so there was that element as well. The anti-Semitism did enter the campaign. Giles French, the editor of the Sherman County Journal, published an editorial. I have yet to see the whole editorial. Interestingly, that month is missing at the University of Oregon's library, but I'll find it somewhere, probably at Oregon Historical Society, in which French referred to, I think he said, the financial incumen of his race or something, or his religion, whatever it was. It was the code word. And Charles Sprague, the editor of the Oregon Statesman, just jumped on that and said, this has no place, etc. There were, I think, some other elements to that aspect of the whispering campaign that I've not found yet. So that was an element. But you have to remember that it wasn't just that the state was, shall we say, divided. It's that up to that point, the progressive party in Oregon was the Republican Party. And the Democrats were, in the words of the late Hans Linde, very inarticulate. And Dick was so articulate. And that's what he did on the floor of the state house and the state senate. Every day, he sort of gave everybody a pep talk, a lecture, however you want to call it. So that really, that is a large element of his political significance in Oregon. He created the Oregon Democratic Party. All the others who followed, Vera Katz, Lessa Coyne, Neil Goldschmidt, they're all following in his wake. I would submit even down today with Ron Wyden and Jeff Merkley. They're not knockoffs. They're all original in their own ways. Don't get me wrong, but he really gave them the way in. And as soon as he wins in '54, then as soon as 1956, Democrats win all of the statewide seats as well as congressional seats. Charlie Porter wins in Eugene, that district, and Al Ullman wins in Eastern Oregon out of Baker City. When I grew up in Pendleton, Eastern Oregon was a Democratic territory. And Ullman held that seat for, gosh, I forgot, 20, 30 years, something like that. And the governor becomes Bob Holmes out of Gerhardt, of all places, and Democrat. So he was a very he's a transformative figure, Dick was, on more than one level. That's the fascinating thing about the guy.
Yeah. Oh, I really appreciate.
I think also, Judy and Steve, I think he was also a man of his times in that the times were changing. This is well before Dylan, obviously, in that even during the Eisenhower administration, the attitudes toward civil rights was changing, probably begun during Roosevelt and Truman's eras, but it continues to advance. And Guy Gordon, who had been the Republican, as I recall, was really focusing. He stayed back east by and large. He really didn't come west as much as he could have, partly because it's a long way in those days. And Neuberger was here, so he really focused on that. And he, I think, along with Maureen, understood what was interesting and what was of interest to Oregonians: land, conservation issues. They're also becoming national things. And Neuberger really grasped on that. He applied his journalistic skills to that, articulating some of these issues. And I think that's why he was able to really literally launch his national political career on that sort of thing. Also, what's interesting is you look at what's happening in Oregon. I mean, even Governor Hatfield, 1958, he begins to make his shift. I mean, he'd done so before, but even the Republicans had become more progressive in that sense. So in that sense, I think Neuberger was able to ride that shift and also propel it to some extent in the 1950s with his election, and then certainly with his tenure in office.
Well, Neuberger and Hatfield, come together for a brief moment. Hatfield introduces a civil rights bill, and I believe it was the 1954 legislature or 52.
54.
And Neuberger is one of his co-sponsors. And in my interview with Hatfield, he said it was a remarkable experience to work with Dick on that bill. I've just remembered the name of the woman who wrote the thesis on it, Celia Ann Doris. I'd love to find her. I don't know where she is now. At any rate, but you're right, Chet. Dick saw the change coming in, and you see it in he has quite a correspondence with Wayne Morris during this period of time, and Dick is noticing that Democrats are out registering Republicans at that time, so he sees that shift coming as well.
I would also add that I think that an important element of Neuberger's style and life as he runs for the Senate, and especially after he becomes senator, is he's beginning to actually shape Oregonians' lives with his writing and his politics in the same way that, say, Duniway and Applegate certainly did. And I think that's part of what makes them eminent, is unlike a lot of Oregonians whose names we might recognize, who shaped their own lives, unlike them, Neuberger, Duniway, and Applegate shaped a lot of Oregonians' lives, and they continue to shape our lives today, which Steve alluded to much earlier in the conversation.
If you look at the novels that Abigail Scott Duniway wrote, they're about today.
Mhm.
You know, in the 19th century, she was writing about what women face, both on legally and emotionally, shall we say.
And Applegate's work in terms of civil rights and Native American rights, same kind of issue.
Yeah.
No, thank you. Oh my gosh, time is marching on, and we do want to get to some questions from the audience. So do put your questions in. I'm going to just pop one more question in before we turn to the audience that I really want to make sure we get to. And that's really looking at Richard Neuberger's, his connection with his own Jewish identity. You know, he was sort of, if I may, sort of the quintessential mid-20th century German Jew that by all accounts, he wasn't particularly observant, but at least from what I've read, it's clear he was Jewish and he wasn't running away from being Jewish. Obviously, you started the program, Steve, by talking about the connection with Rabbi Rose, just installed, giving the eulogy at his funeral. He is buried at Congregation Beth Israel. He's known as the second Jew to become part of the US Senate. So he went to Germany. We know other episodes in his history where he did confront anti-Semitism. So how did all this inform him, if you would? And I'll throw it to both of you, but Steve, starting with you.
He also had a relationship with Rabbi Stephen Wise, who had been at Temple Beth Israel and then moved east. And Stephen Wise was the editor of Opinion, a journal of Jewish life and letters, which I discovered on one piece of paper that Dick mentioned, where he had written for Opinion magazine. The minute I told Judy all this when we first met in her archive, she said, well, that's not surprising at all. But what Ruth said was, we were not observant. We went, for the holidays, and that was it. But I've found two things that I think are quite illuminating as to that side of him, that he clearly, one of these things about Neuberger is he sort of narrates his life as he goes along in various ways, in articles and other ways. Well, this is a letter that Dick wrote to Herman H. Pollack, who was a member of the faculty of Temple Emmanuel in San Francisco. The Temple was, Pollack wrote Neuberger, he said, if you would favor us with a few words above your signature that we may display in our museum under the title of What the World's Greatest Men Say About Their Religious Heritage. So Dick responded, my religious heritage means a great deal to me in terms of spiritual, ethical, and moral values. I believe that religion is of significance and benefit only so long as it is translated into everyday life. I believe that the 10 Commandments have genuine meaning only when we obey their precepts in our relations with our fellow men. I believe that if you want to have a friend, you must be a friend. That is the importance of religion. It is not something merely to be confined to a temple or a tabernacle or cathedral. In our attitudes toward other people, we must translate the teachings in the Bible. That is what my religion means to me.
Mm.
And then in a much different way, he responded to a young girl in Clatskanie, Oregon, who was part of a Sunday school class. And she had sent him a handwritten letter asking about what he believed about God. And so Neuberger responds, and you can see here, he's now not writing for the temple in San Francisco, he's writing to a little girl. And he said, so far as I know, no living person has ever seen God. Therefore, I cannot answer the question, who made God and what does God look like? In my opinion, God is within each one of us. God is that which motivates us to do good toward others and to avoid anything which is evil or wrong. I think God is expressed by the doctrine of the brotherhood of man, which appears so clearly in the Sermon on the Mount and in the Ten Commandments. Do unto others as they should unto you. That is my idea of God. He who sees God is someone who follows this rule of life. So he thought about it quite a bit. And then as to your point, Judy, about that he certainly did not hide his Jewishness, in current biography, I found that during the legislative years, that he referred to him once as the only Jew on the ballot. So,
Really
yeah,
not running away from it. Yeah.
not at all,
Yeah.
not at all. Yeah.
Chet, anything to add there? From your
Well, I would just add that I think the brilliance of Steve's thinking of these three people illustrates that wonderful line that all history is biography when you think about it. And I think it's important that we as Oregonians recognize that in our selection of people whom we consider eminent in that regard. Strachey, in his book on eminent Victorians, he was more of a critic. And he was looking at people who had been recognized as eminent, but he didn't really feel necessarily that they deserved that eminence. And I think in Steve's creation here, we're beginning to really understand what makes for eminent Oregonians.
I love that.
Thank you.
So I think the last question, and it actually will be a question for both of you. And I was really struck, Steve, reading the chapter. It is clear. It is sort of unbiased. You're a journalist, and I think my question is, what is it like to write biography? How does your journalistic training help you to write a biography? And then, Chet, as a historian, I would venture to say you might write a different kind of biography than Steve would. I think I would perhaps too, because our brains are just sort of looking, making connections, wanting to say how we might feel about it, for example. But so, Steve, I just throw it to you. How did your training help you get this biography out?
Well, in the most basic sense, Dick Neuberger is a hell of a story. Yeah. If you went to your editor and said,
Stop right there, Steve. That's good.
That's it. He's a hell of a story. Yeah. And because he did narrate his life and what he didn't, Wayne Morris did, and Morris kept everything. It's all in his files at the University of Oregon. The material is there. And again, as I've mentioned, I was fortunate to talk to his contemporaries, and which really illuminated that period of time and how he was viewed. In interviewing, surprisingly, because I really thought a whole lot of the late Herb Schwab, and Herb was a great man. But it was clear in what he had to say, there was resentment. And I picked up among his peers, among Neuberger's contemporaries peers, resentment. And I won't say resentment, but from a writer, a woman I took a class from, who had been in the Oregonian newsroom in her day, and she described watching Neuberger write. She said it was intimidating because he would put a piece of paper in the typewriter, and write the whole story. He would never stop.
Wow. So,
And he
so
didn't use it, and he used a typewriter, not a word processor.
The standard
Right,
type.
right.
Yeah.
So I think, Steve, if I could get you to drill down a little more, and maybe I'm overthinking, but do you sort of have to, do you go down the same rabbit holes as historians? I just have a sense that maybe I'm, as a journalist, do you feel that you're kind of uniquely situated to know what can be in and what can be out, perhaps with more speed than a historian? I know when I'm writing, I sometimes just go down these rabbit holes, and ultimately nothing I've taken 3 days away from some research I'm doing is gonna have any validity to what I've done, but I've had a lot of fun sort of exploring it. So I don't know, Chet, would you agree with that? But do you think that because you've had to be so reactive all your career and write more quickly that you have a...
Oh yeah, I often said in the days I was being a editor and was writing editorials and so forth, my whole nervous system was geared to cough up an editorial by 10 a.m.
Right.
So you do have to make choices quickly.
And Chet, sorry.
It becomes your habit.
Right.
Mhm.
And Chet, would you agree with that? I mean, do you find
Yeah,
when you're
I would.
writing,
I mean, my experience
more
with journalism,
comfortable with it?
even though I did have a brief career in that, was when I was briefly working for the Oregonian, and an editor told me, just stick with the lead, Chet, and the rest of it will take care of itself. But that's not how historians work. I know historians are more interested in the context and the deeper aspects of the personalities of, say, the individuals we're working upon, or the events, because in some cases we're talking about events, not necessarily individuals. So there's a big difference between that.
Yeah.
And the stories certainly add to that. And great historians are really good storytellers, we know, first and foremost. But it's how they can put together a variety of stories, which can sometimes be overwhelming, I think, for a lot of readers.
Sure.
So you approach history a little bit differently from how you might approach journalism, I think, which of course is the first
Sure.
draft of history, right? That's what we like to say.
Thank you. So let's get some questions. We're close to the 1 o'clock, and I hope everybody, I know some people might have to log off at 1 to move on, and you're welcome to stay. We will go just a few minutes past because we've got some good questions. An easy one, Steve, you and I were together. Someone is asking why Neuberger Hall at PSU was renamed, and there is another hall called Neuberger Hall, but Steve, I'll let you speak to that.
Yeah.
It was just moved.
It was moved because someone came. It was established as Neuberger Hall because Dick played a major role in the creation of Portland State College. It was moved because someone came along and gave the university a lot of money, and so they put that person's name on what was Neuberger Hall, and they moved it to the administration building where the president is and so forth. It's very nice where it is. However, I know a colleague of mine, I won't say her name because I don't want to broadcast that, but she felt that was a travesty what Portland State did.
Well, they had a donor, right, who
Yes.
gave money for another building.
Yeah.
Someone's asking a little more to describe what his liberalism was like in 1954. So what was it like to be a liberal in 1954?
That's a really good question. That's a really good question. He did talk about in that campaign about civil rights. Whoever asked this question, you've really prompted my next stage of research. I'm going to head back to the University of Oregon in a few weeks. The archive's open again, of course. And there are a number of things that I want to look at, but that's very good. I mean, he was defining it. There was no one else out there with him. On his left is the Oregon Commonwealth Federation, which was Monroe Sweetland, a name familiar to some of you, I think. And Dick steered clear of the Oregon Commonwealth Federation because he didn't want to be tagged as a socialist or a communist even, which Monroe was. So he played, it was a very delicate dance that he did with regard to them. At the same time, I found in the OHS archive, I've forgotten who said this, but it was sort of almost an undercover report from a meeting referring to Dick as Oregon's #1 radical. Well, that probably belonged to Monroe Sweetland, but that's how he was viewed as well. You go back to the University of Oregon, what he was doing there that so upset the fraternity crowd was that he said, you know, the depression is on, the dorms are half empty. Students can't afford to live there. Why not adjust the rent for them and fill the dorms? And then they came out with a food plan as well. How to eat on whatever it was, so many dollars and cents per week with menus and all of that. It was very much personalized by him, but I appreciate you asking that question. That's
We're going to read the book when it comes out. It's
line of
gonna have
inquiry.
this whole, it'll have a whole chapter about it.
Yeah.
And I think it's also critical, Steve, when you do start to bore in on that subject, not to bore you, is to talk about what a liberal meant then and what a liberal means today, and what a liberal meant, you know, in 1918 or so.
Yeah.
Because we know the word conservative means different things as we move through time. So I think you have to make those adjustments.
Yeah. Bill Robbins, the OSU history emeritus, says, and I agree with him entirely, says Dick Neuberger was an unreconstructed Franklin Roosevelt New Dealer.
Right.
And that's what motivated him to the end. You know, at the memorial service at Temple of Beth Israel, Lyndon Johnson said, he was the truest liberal I've ever known of Dick. And Richard Russell, who was at the opposite end of the spectrum, which I closed the book with, the chapter with, said, you know, I didn't agree with this guy, but he was essentially what he was saying, he was very honest. He put this postal worker pay increase up and an increase in the price of the stamp to pay for it.
Yeah.
So
which made him very popular.
Yeah.
And on his conflict, someone is asking, you know, wants to know a little bit more about his relationship with Wayne Morse, which we know was really complicated.
Yes. Morris was his law professor, his mentor, antagonist, you know, by flunking him, but he was just being a law school prof. The whole law school aspect of things we could spend a lot of time on, but I want to cut to the chase with the question that's been asked. Then when he runs for the legislature and is in the Senate, there's a correspondence between Morris, who's now in Washington as U.S. Senator, and Morris coaches Neuberger all the way on the fine points of what we might call retail politics. Don't put your opponent's picture on your brochure. That only gives him more visibility. Do this, do that. And then Morris raises a lot of money for Neuberger's campaign on the East Coast. He works the living rooms on Park Avenue. He works the labor unions. Morris does, for money. I've seen the contributor list. It's in Morris's paper. That's phenomenal. Out of state money, principally. And he speaks in Oregon too. He makes a lot of speeches for Neuberger. So they're very much aligned at that period of time. Dick becomes a senator, and there is this break, this fracture. And you can choose your reason for why that happened. In my chapter, I mentioned, I think, 3 of those reasons. Maureen said, it's very simple. Wayne had never had anyone of Dick's intelligence as his colleague.
Wow.
Which is a jump to what Lloyd Tupling, who was Dick's administrative assistant, said to me. The reason, very simply, for the feud was there's only so much limelight. And Dick, and this gets to the prior person's question about what does a liberal mean? Well, it sounds strange today, but they were competing for who is the more liberal. That went on a lot in America. So what you see during this period of this intense feud, which got very ugly, was that prominent American intellectual liberals like Arthur Schlesinger Jr. wrote Morris essentially saying, knock it off. This is not good for any of us. And I will say just one last thing about the correspondence between the two of them. I was told by my predecessor in Washington, D.C., A. Robert Smith, and I found it's true in looking at the letters. Neuberger wrote his letters for history. He positioned himself and wrote in a very diplomatic way. Morris just, they reek of venom.
Wow. Are Morris's letters published?
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
They are. Oh, wow.
They're in the archives. I've not seen all of them.
Mhm.
There's a batch I've not yet
Wow.
seen, but I'm hoping that will happen.
Wow.
I think they were also both extremely self-confident individuals, which is not necessarily common in politics. A lot of politicians, ironically, are not necessarily self-confident people, but these were two very self-confident people who knew their intellectual depths, and they knew they were beyond everyone. You know, everyone was not in the same pool as they were. And you know, what of course would be interesting is to know what happened with Morris in the 1960s, you know, after all of that. And, you know, life changed a lot, you know, and in some respects, Morse continued his trajectory as the leading liberal voice. And, you know, who knows what would have happened had Neuberger, you know, that's one of those what ifs, but, you know, it's always fun.
Yeah.
I'm not going to ask you that silver ball question. Someone did, Steve, if you just mind saying how he died. He died so tragically young, but what was the cause of death?
Well, he, in about 57, I think, testicular cancer was found. And there was surgery and radiation and such, and he went back to the Senate. There was, it was in remission, and then it wasn't. And I've talked to Lloyd Tupling about Lloyd taking him to the airport to fly home and knowing that this was the last time they would see each other. So.
Thank you. What a wonderful discussion. I hope this spurs you even more to get this biography finished and published, and then we'll invite you back again. So
Yeah.
You said 2 years. We can wait 2 years.
Yeah, appreciate it.
Thank you both. Thank you, Chet. Thank you, Steve. I
Yeah,
do
Judy.
want to do a shout out for Amber, who is Amber Curson, our IT person lurking in the background, who always makes me relax when we do these programs, because I know she's taking care of all the tech. And I do want to also thank Becca Biggs, our communications manager, who handled all the publicity for the event. It has been recorded. Give us a day or two and there will be a recording on our website, which you are welcome to share. Thanks everyone for joining. Look forward to seeing you next time, and a few thanks to both of you for a wonderful conversation.
Thank you so much.
Take care,
you.
everyone. Thank you. Bye.
Bye.